Okay, so we are in Perek Mem Zayin Posuk Yud Dalid, and what we're going to learn from Pasuk Yud Dalid till the penultimate pasuk in this parsha is about Yosef's arrangement of the whole economic and social order and political order, in a sense, of Mitzrayim. And what's stressed from Pasuk Yudalid through Pasuk Kaf Vav is Pare, and that everything that Yosef is doing, he's doing on behalf of Pare. That starts with Pasuk Yudalid, the pasuk we're up to, which ends with Vayove Yosef Yesakesef, base of Pharaoh. So everything he's doing is for the power, might, and wealth of Pharaoh, and it ends in that second to last pasuk with again the word Pharaoh Lifaroi. There about the Admas Kehanim not being Pharaohs. We'll get to that soon. And the fact Pharaoh is repeated here continuously 11 times we have in the next in these 9 psukim, in these 13 psukim, we have the word Pare appearing 11 times again and again. It's stressed that everything is being done for Pare. What Yosef is doing here is consolidating power in the hands of Pare, economically and socially. Okay, and the sequence of events is that he, just to give it the brief overview, he collects all the kesef. When the kesef is all in the hands of Pare, then he moves on to trading grain for mikneh. Then there's no more kesef nor mikneh. All there is are their own bodies and their lands, which then also become Pare's, their lands and their very bodies. And then there's this exception. Now I'm up to Pasuk Chavbeis. Well, this Pasuk Chav Aleph about the moving people around. Okay, to get to that, that's not so clear what that's all about. And then there's the exception of the lands of the Kehanim. That was not given to Pare. Okay, because they received food, an allotment from Pare, so they didn't need to sell their lands. I think it's the Pasuk the Pasuk. And then there's the arrangement of how they're going to receive zera to plant and give a percentage to Pare from then on. And Lipare, then it ends. So basically it's consolidating the whole order of Mitzrayim to belong to Pare, from the silver to the cattle to the people to their lands. Everything belongs to Pare. And because everything belongs to Pare, everyone is working for Pare. He generously allows them to keep 4/5, but he takes this 20% tax, which is a choik ad hayom hazeh. So Yosef here makes Pare mighty and essentially consolidates the power of the state in his hands. That's what's happening here. Okay, so let's start with some comments on this pasuk, and then we'll talk about the broader point over here, what we can learn about this. So first we start with this word Vayilaket Yosef, as kol kesef. Vayilaket means he collected. It's a funny word to use for kesef because it's typically used in the context of grain. Sometimes there are other things that are collected, or a little pouch in which someone holds things. It's called a yalkut. of course, grain that falls is leket. So, is he collecting kesef? Is he walking around Mitzrayim finding lost pieces of kesef that he then collects? So why do we use the word vaylake? Now, the basis of this wealth was the grain, which he had collected from the whole of Mitzrayim. It didn't use the word vaylake there, again, because vaylake is for like small pieces of grain or small amounts of grain. It says vayikboitz eskoloich. But it could be that the pasuk is using a grain word in the context of gathering all the silver, because since what Yosef did was he traded the grain, he caused the power that he affected over the grain through interpreting Pharaoh's dreams correctly. He converted that into kesef because he controlled the grain, traded it for kesef. So basically, the pasuk it's saying that Yosef turned his mastery over the grain into a harvest or reaping of silver. So that may be why it uses a grain expression. It's like he harvested all the money of Mitzrayim. Now, we have to think about, just want to mention this briefly, we have to get back to this. What's the whole focus about kesef? The major focus on kesef. What do I mean? He collects all the kesef. Only when there's no kesef left, everyone's like, hey, wait a second, there's no kesef left. And the pasuk repeats that. Vayitoim hakesef me'eretz Mitzrayim u'me'eretz Canaan. And the people came and said, look, ofes kesef. So we're going to die. And Yosef says, okay, you know what? Im ofes kesef, then I'll take I'll take mikneh. So he's very insistent that he wants kesef. And it's only when there's no kesef left that that he moves on to mikneh. So it could be, and then we have to understand why is that the case. So why is he like, look, I want every last piece of silver. Okay, when that's done, then they're like, you know what, listen, why don't you take Shava Kesef as well? He's like, okay, you know what, if there's no silver left, I'll take Shava Kesef. So that means there was an insistence, it was important first to collect all the Kesef. And it could be, so we have to understand why that's the case. We'll get to that hopefully next time. But it could be that the word Vayilakate, collected, is being used because he, yes, the word collected is used for minute amounts, but the point of the pasuk is specifically that Yosef collected every single last piece of kesef. So wherever there was a small amount of kesef, Yosef would make sure to get it from there, and therefore maybe uses the word vayilakate. Related to this is the pasuk in Kehelis Perek He. Kehelis Perek He is all about Yosef. It starts with the fact that we can't speak the words of Hashem. He's in the heaven, we are on earth, and dreams are associated with many words, not knowing the word of Hashem. Okay, this takes us back to, of course, the beginning of Vigesh, and these psukim we keep on going back to in the context of Yaakov and Yosef. Pasuk Vav talks about Chaloimus again, and Eselakim Yira. Yosef said Eselakim Ani Yare. And then don't be surprised if there's Oshik in the Medina. We spoke about that once. The context of Yosef and his working on behalf of Pare. I think that was the context. It's very important. We have to get to this pasuk, have to remember for next year, because last week we spoke about the psukim in Mishlei that talk about the Oshik, and we applied it to this parsha where Yosef is applying Oshik to Mitzrayim and turning the screws of power on them and economic screws because they're in distress from the hunger. And that's Oshik, and it says that in Mishlei Perek Ches. We'll look at that again. And as we mentioned, he's doing that on behalf of Paro, so he sort of is inevitably has to exercise Oishik, and just what that means in Pashup Shat, meaning he has to put his genius in the service of Paro. So the morals can be determined by Paro, and then the practical genius is of Yosef has to be put into the service of those morals, even if they're imperfect. Otherwise, he's not being a good servant, and he'll lose his position. So there's Oishik going on over here, and there's a very important pasuk in Mמשלת Kehelas Perek Hey Pasuk Zayin. What happens if you see Oishik, Rosh, Gezel? Don't be surprised, because it goes higher and higher. And I want to go back to that pasuk, and we looked at it once before, and I think it may mean that don't blame Yosef for this, because really you have to take it all the way to the top to realize where it's coming from. So, but let's remember. I have to try to remember to get back to that pasuk for next year. And then the next pasuk talks about the king and how he's a slave to the field. Okay, well, we have kings, we have fields. Land is everything. A lot going on with the Yosef story there, the slave who became a king. Okay, we'll have to get to that soon. I mean, not today. I'm just showing that there's a lot of psukim here. It really starts on the Perek Dalet, but I want to get to the pasuk that relates to this kesef, which is the next pasuk. Oyhev kesef lo yispa kesef, umi'oyev behemon lo yisevu agam zehovel. The one who loves kesef is never satisfied with kesef. And then there's something about grain. Well, this seems to be related to this parsha. Why? Because Yosef said, I cannot get enough silver. He would only take mikneh after there was no silver left. So that is an illustration of the fact that the one who seeks kesef can never get enough of it. So at no point did Yosef say, okay, that's enough silver, we can move on to something else. It was only when, really, he always wanted silver. It's only when there's no silver that he could take something else. And then there's something about the grain there. So we have to understand that pasuk, Kehelas Perek Hey pasuk test better, and also this whole thing, the whole focus on kesef, but I suspect that's a clue that there's something about the allure of kesef more than anything else for those who are into that kind of thing. Okay, so we have to remember to get back to that, and those psukim and kehelas. Now, there's another stress over here in this very pasuk, Vayav Yosef as a kesef base of Paro, that he's working on behalf of Paro. And so on this pasuk, Vayalakid Yosef is called a kesef. The Mechilta quotes a pasuk, Ish Amunais Rav Brachos. We're going to look up that pasuk soon. It's very important where that pasuk is written. But first, I want to point out that on this pasuk, Yosef collected all the kesef. The Medrash Bereshis Rabbah brings, Yosef is the Ish Amunais and Rav Brachos. He's very faithful. And the Mechilta says that Yosef fulfilled Signov, because here he's managing all the kesef. And look, Vayove Yosef as a kesef base of Paro. So he collects all the kesef and he delivers it to Paro. He didn't use this opportunity to enrich himself. So then the Medrash says, another Medrash says, Vayalakid Yosef be'emuno liket. So that's coming from this Ish Emunis Brachos. So it could be that that's why it says Vayalakid, he collected, because collected, as we said before, also means to take every last kesef. So Vayalakid Yosef is called a kesef. So why say this word Vayalakid? So we had two ideas so far, and now I'm saying a third one. One idea was it's a grain kind of word. It's a word from the field of related to grain. Second idea was the pasuk is making the point that he got every single last piece of silver, because it was a focus on I cannot get enough silver. Now, it's only when the silver is done that he's even going to consider taking a different kind of payment. And thirdly, now I'm saying is that the fact that Yosef is working for Paro and that he's so faithful that he doesn't let any silver get away from Paro. And that's what makes him an Ish Emunah, so therefore he uses this word Vayalakid. Okay, now let's look up that pasuk Ish Emunah. So the Medrash, Bereshis Rabbah says, look, this pasuk Ish Emunah Rav Brachos applies to Yosef. So where's this pasuk? It's in Mishlei Perek Chavches, and if you remember last week, we looked very closely at that parak. We looked very closely at that parak because we noticed that as Yosef is supporting his family, the whole Mitzrayim does not have lechem. And this lechem ein in the previous pasuk is an ironic juxtaposition to the psukim that describe Yosef supporting his family. We further noticed that this whole narrative of Yosef essentially dispossessing Mitzrayim and making everyone serfs and completely dependent on Pare is also juxtaposed to his own family, who were given land and given possession by Ye'achazuba. So while he's dispossessing the rest of Mitzrayim, his own family is favored and gets land, and while he's supporting his family, the rest of Mitzrayim is suffering from lack of bread. And to this we notice the pasuk in Mishlei Perek Chav Ches, pasuk Gimel, which talks about the Gever Rosh Oishik Dalim. So there's that Oishik we mentioned before. Then Kehelis talks about what happens if you see Oishik. So you have and the way we explain this pasuk, you have a Gever, a mighty person, who's Rosh, who is on the brink of becoming poor, like Yosef told his brothers, Penti Varesh. And in order to avoid that fate, he is, instead of accepting the fact that he's facing a poverty, he's Oishik Dalim, people that are already poor, and that's like motor soichif ve'ein lechem. So that's a lechem ein, like rain that can fall down torrentially, but nonetheless doesn't necessarily bring bread if it falls in the way that doesn't make things grow. So to Yosef, who's taking care of Bnei Yisrael, the rain people, but he's doing it by being Oshik Dalim because he's afraid they're going to become Rush. So that's associated with lechem ein. And then we noticed, once you notice this, you keep going there in Mishneh Perek Ches, and you see all these psukim that relate to Yosef's story. Among them is this pasuk, which the Medrash quotes, Ish emunis rav brachas v'atzlaha asher lo yinake. But the way I suggested to read it is that Yosef is the atzlaha asher. He's trying to get rich quick. The Medrash is applying the first half of the pasuk on him. Just parenthetically, remember the next pasuk says Hake panim loy toiv val pas lechem yifsha gever. You're not supposed to be make panim. You shouldn't be favorites. But when it comes to bread, the gever could do something wrong. So, however, and what I say, however, because the Medrash says Yosef is the Ishamunas, I say he's the Atzla Hashir. But that's not necessarily a contradiction because there's what Yosef's position, and then there's his employer Pare. So we can blame it, like the pasuk does in Kehelis, says, look, you got to go, if you want to understand why things are so awful, you have to realize that there's a hierarchy, and really you have to look at the top. Okay, we're going to have to look at that again. We have to look at that closely, what's going on in that pasuk. But Yosef can be demonstrating a loyalty to Pare, which makes him an ish emunais, rav brachais, and at the same time, he's Atzla Hashir because he is loyal. Let's say you're loyal to your boss who's an immoral person. So what happens? Do you have Rav Brachis or do you have Lo Yanake? Very interesting question. Pasuk says, Isha Munis Rav Brachis, V'atzla Hashir Lo Yanake. So the faithful person leads to many blessings, but if someone presses his advantage to become rich, even when he maybe should be more patient, or should be more moral, lo yinake. Well, what if you have someone who's working for someone who's atzla hasher? He's working for him in a way of emunas. Okay, well, that's exactly the way I suspect here that we're looking at Yosef. He's doing nothing wrong. He's very faithful to Pare. He's so faithful. He's more Pare than Pare. That's the problem here, is that he brings out what's latent in Pare, but Pare is the atzla hasher. Yosef's just the ishamunah. So what happens? Do you get a bracha or do you get a lo yinake? Or do you get both? And what do you mean you get both? I'm just what I'm foreshadowing here, and I don't want to jump ahead because I'm not sure, but this is what it suggests. There's an element in this wealth of Mitzrayim which is ill-begotten, and there's an element that it's actually kosher money, let's say, good money. Why? Because Yosef is doing the right thing to get this money, given the fact that he's in this terrible place called Mitzrayim. So is this money that one should become rich from or not? The answer is, well, Pare shouldn't get rich, but Yosef should. And lo and behold, this money is eventually, of course we know the fact that the money is all coming into one place is very significant because eventually the money of Mitzrayim is going to go to Bnei Israel. So that's why I suspect that there's indeed a dual thing happening over here. This money is Ish Amunah's money from the perspective of Yosef and therefore Bnei Israel, but it's Atz Lahashir money from the perspective of Paro, and therefore Lo Yonake, he's in fact going to lose all his money. Okay, so we really have to think about this. I wanted to point out another pasuk in Mishra Perek Ches, which I don't know if I mentioned it last week, but this is so important. So just take a look at Perek Dezayin. There talks about Rav Ma'ashakois. So I say there's oishik happening to Mitzrayim, and instead a person should be a Sunni Batz. I think that we mentioned this pasuk last week. But if you look at pasuk Yudal there, it says Asher Mefachi Tamed Umaksha Libo Yipol B'Ra'ah. Okay. The person who's always afraid is fortunate. The one who hardens his heart will fall in an evil thing. He's not going to, right? An evil's going to come around, then he's going to not be able to withstand it. Now, who's Maksha Liboy? We know Pare, right? Of course. When he actually slave Pare, and so on and so forth. So, okay. Now, why was Pare Maksha Liboy? Because who introduced this whole business of the leader of Mitzrayim being Kshelev? Yosef, as the pasuk says, Dibar ish adonai haaretz itoru koshes. Yosef says we are instituting a cruel and tough form of government in Mitzrayim. So Yosef introduces, as I said before, he outpares Pare. He's more Egyptian than the Egyptians because he brings out what's latent in Mitzrayim. Why does that happen? I think we did mention this once before, because this is what happens when monotheism comes into contact with polytheism. Polytheist says like this: I have my way. It's not total, because it's other gods, so take it easy. Along comes the monotheist and says, look, whatever you believe in has to be total, because only one God. Problem is, only one God is not the God of Mitzrayim. So when you try to totalize and bring to its logical extreme whatever particular fragment of reality Mitzrayim stands for, ends up in disaster. That's in a nutshell the key to this story. And it very much relates to this whole narrative in the Pashas Vigash. What do I mean to say? So Yosef brings out, so we have this pasuk in Mishlei about Maksha Liboy in the association with connecting this parsha. So I want to say that, this parsha is definitely priming Paro to be Maksha Liboy. Here's why. Because what happens in our parsha is a totalization of control. Yosef totalizes the control of the state over everyone's bodies, lands, horses, money. And all of that for Paro. So, of course, what that's going to do, naturally, is going to give Paro a toughness and a brittleness that comes from toughness, that he's no longer flexible, because he commands everything, and therefore everything must serve his end. This is what Yosef essentially wrought through this totalization of control described over here at the end of Parshas Vigash. What this does was makes Paro Kshelev and makes him more specifically, makes him inflexible regarding that everyone has to be his slave, because that's what Yosef did. He made the whole Mitzrayim belong to him and be his slave. So when there was a question of Bnei Yisrael perhaps not being his slaves, Paro is not able to be flexible about that. Okay, now this is amazing. Now this is, I think, a very key point, which brings us to another thing over here, another issue here. What's the general thing that's happening in this parsha? There's this totalization of control. There's a carve out for, let's see what happens over here. There's a totalization of control beginning to end. Land, money, cattle, people. Okay, and then there's this idea they have to give 20%. Then there's this carve out for the Kahanim. And then there's a last pasuk, which, as we explained, is not unconnected. In fact, it's very connected to everything it says till now, because everything it says till now is that everything belongs to Pari, except for the Kahanim, who have a carve-out. This is another exception, because Bnei Yisrael also had land. An amazing thing, this whole business of everything becoming Pari does not apply to Bnei Yisrael. As we mentioned, going back to Pasuk Yudalef, and then the next thing you know is that he takes all the land and makes it Paris. They get an achuzah, a holding. Okay, so what happens over here? Everything is Paris. Everything is part of his power. Therefore, he's maksha liboy. He insists everything has to be. He needs complete power. But notice here, the Kahanim are out and Bnei Yisrael are out. Bnei Yisrael are not his avodim. Okay, well, in the beginning of Sefer Shemais, Bnei Yisrael are going to have to be his avodim. He's not going to let them free. This makes perfect sense. If Mamish follows from this parsha, because in this parsha the whole Mitzrayim became his avodim, except for Bnei Yisrael. So it's the only natural thing is that parsha should say, wait a second, I want this carve out. We'll get to the Kahanim soon. I want the Bnei Yisrael to be my avodim as well. Now, but they're not his avodim. Why? Why is the whole Mitzrayim the avodim of Paro and not Bnei Yisrael? Why'd they get this right? Well, obviously because they're Yosef's people. But now we have the beginning of Sefer Shmos. A new king arises on Mitzrayim. Asher lo yada es Yosef. So the next thing you know, Bnei Yisrael are also supposed to be the avodim of Paro. Okay, like the rest of Mitzrayim. That's what I'm suggesting to read. We always read Shmos. It's like, they prey on this foreign population, this guest population, and make them into slaves. But actually, the whole Mitzrayim were slaves to Paro. Bnei Yisrael were not slaves because they were Yosef's people and they were treated separately and not part of this whole totalization of power in the hands of Paro. So when there's a king who's lo yad es Yosef, he wants them to be slaves because he's used to everyone being his slaves. Now, another thing to think about is that what Yosef did to Paro, this totalization of power, is really the way things are supposed to be vis-a-vis Hashem. Okay, we mentioned before there's an element of monotheism and polytheism getting involved here. But first of all, let's say the land belongs to Paro. Well, we have the pasuk of Kili Haaretz. And everyone's Paro's avodim, avodehem, we're supposed to be avodim of Hashem, so there's this, Paro here is total, and of course, Paro is like the God. Okay. The Kahanim get a chok from Paro, like the Kahanim of Hashem get a chok. However, there's some major difference, which is that the Kahanim of Hashem do not have land, and these Kahanim do have land, okay? So it seems to be an inverse, but I'm not 100% sure about that. I have to think about that, because the pasuk says, Kili ha'aretz, the land belongs to Hashem, and that's why we are gerim v'teshavim, we're not allowed to sell it. The Kahanim, in a certain sense, have land more than Yisrael do, because I don't know if Kili ha'aretz applies to the Kahanim's land. It's like Hashem gave it to them to live in. It's the chayk. Okay, I'm not so sure if it's exactly the opposite. Al kapanim, there is a question over here. Okay, so there's a parallel over here. Here, Paro is like the God, like we have in the beginning of Miketz. The river is his, and of course, nothing like that to make a person like She'elev. But there are two people or two groups that are not Paro's. One is Bnei Yisrael, and one are the Kahanim. Okay. And now, if you think about it, the carve-out of the Kahanim and the carve-out of Bnei Yisrael becomes very sharp. In other words, because there's this consolidation, this totalization of power, therefore, whatever elements are not part of that totalization of power now stand out. Till now, right, if everything's just like a democracy or a bunch of different powers everyone vying for their interests, like, okay, fine, there's just a bunch of different things happening. But all of a sudden, there's this totalization, there's this unification of the state under Paro, then the two elements that are not part of that unification become very noticeable and create a certain tension. As we mentioned before, there's a tension with the fact that Bnei Yisrael are not his avodim, maybe they should be his avodim too, like we see in Sefer Shmos. But the point now is that we have two things. We have two groups that are not part of this totalization. That's the Kahanim and Bnei Yisrael. And Bnei Yisrael, in other words, if there's this totalization, but on the other hand, you have Bnei Yisrael, then we have a possibility maybe Bnei Yisrael should become Avadim. But there's another group that's not part of this totalization, and that's the Kehanim. Okay, and of course it's very interesting. Why is this whole point? Why is this interesting that the Kehanim are not part of the system of Paris? I would suggest the following. Because really this is about Bnei Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael stand out. They're not part of the system of totalization of power. Okay, but neither are the Kehanim. Now, the Kehanim are very interesting regarding Yosef, because Yosef is married to the daughter of the Kohen Oin. So, in fact, some of the Mepharshim might forget, or some Rishonim say, yeah, you know why the Kehanim got to carve out? Because Yosef is partial to them, because his father was the Kohen Oin. So, if you read this, let's say, if you read this parak schematically, so there's Pare and his control, and that's basically everything, mediated through Yosef. But then there are the Yosef people, Bnei Yisrael, are not quite given to Pare, because they're Yosef's people. The Kehanim maybe are also Yosef's people, but either way, the Kehanim, because he's married to a Bas Kayin of Ayin, but either way, the Kehanim are also not completely put under Pare's control. Now, Bnei Yisrael have this unique status because they're his brothers. So if they're his brothers, the brothers of Yosef, well, maybe they should become Kehanim. Okay, so this is what I want to read. I want to read that the significance of the Kehanim not being part of the totalization of Egypt is as follows. Since there's this totalization, the consolidation of Mitzrayim, those that are out of that now stand in tension with that, and there's going to be some friction. But there are two groups that are out of that. There's Bnei Yisrael and there's the Kehanim. So this whole move that we need Bnei Yisrael to maybe be folded into that centralization of Mitzrayim, there is a way out of that, which is that Bnei Yisrael should be Kehanim. And why would they be Kehanim? Because Yosef, who was partial to the Kehanim by being married to the daughter of the Kohen Oin, is also partial to his own brothers, because they're his brothers, but maybe we could just wrap that all onto one thing and make them into Kehanim. So what is that? But Pare said, no, you guys are not Kehanim, you're going to be Avodim. Now comes Sinai and Atam Tiyu Mamlachas Kohanim. So that's how I want to read that. That there's this, there are the people that stand outside the system, that's Bnei Yisrael and the Kehanim. And Pare is pushing back and saying, I don't want Bnei Yisrael to be out of the system, they have to be part of the system, they have to be Avodim. And comes Har Sinai and says, no, they do stand outside of the system, because they're actually Kehanim. That's my suggestion over here. Now, just to wrap that up, right, so Pare says they're going to be Avodim, and Hashem says, no, they're going to be Kehanim. As we mentioned before, there's a significant part of the whole parsha is that there's a collection, consolidation, centralization of all the wealth, which eventually goes to Bnei Yisrael, especially the portable wealth. Maybe also, I don't know if we mentioned this, I don't think so, but I think I alluded to this, the fact that Yosef first wants to collect all the kesef is maybe very significant because they're going to take the kesef with them when they leave Mitzrayim. Mikneh, is not the same kind of durable good or as portable. So the real money is kesef. Oyev kesef lo yispa kesef. So if you want to make sure that all the money is in one place, the first thing you have to focus on is the kesef. And in fact, that's what they took with them when they left Mitzrayim. So maybe that's why the kesef is so important. But Akopanim, so that's something that's happening over here. The money of Mitzrayim is very significant because they're going to take it with them when they leave. And about this taking money of the nations, we have a pasuk in the end of Yeshaya Perek Samech Aleph, pasuk Hey, pasuk Vav. Va'atem kohane Hashem tikarehu mishavasei Elokeinu ye'omer lachem chel goyim toichelu b'chvoidom tisyamor. So you will be called Kahane Hashem, Mesharas Elokeinu, and therefore you will consume the wealth of the nations. So, very good. Now it all comes together that the Kehanim of Hashem are supposed to get the Chil Goyim. There's these Kehanim in Mitzrayim who are not, at least not part of the being owned by Pare. And then this Bnei Yisrael are going to become the Kahane Hashem, and they're the ones who are ultimately going to take all this wealth that Pare got in a way that's undeserved. Okay, so that's it. So basically what we learned was There's this parsha of consolidating control to Paro. It's taking kesef. It's abusive of Mitzrayim, but it's also at the same time Yosef is being faithful to Paro as Paro. That's something we have to explore further. There are these three groups. One is Mitzrayim and Paro becomes a Kshay Lev because of that, and Yosef thinks it looks like Yosef is consolidating his power, but he's also causing his power to become more brittle because less flexible, because he becomes tough and he needs everyone to be a slave. And that's given expression by the fact that there are these two groups that are not included in that consolidation. One is Bnei Yisrael and one is the Kahanim. And that sets up a tension that maybe Bnei Yisrael should be the Avodim folded in, that's what Paro thinks, or maybe the Bnei Yisrael should be the Kahanim, that's what Hashem says. And the Kahanim are the ones who end up getting the money. Avodim, Kohanim, right? Maybe they should be Kohanim because Yosef is married to the Kohanim and these are his people. So maybe that's a possible way they could actually could have been considered Kohanim in Mitzrayim even, just possibly. Okay, we'll leave it at that.